Hey guys, it's Jasper. In last week's writing vlog, I talked about how I've been using map making to help with my story, brainstorming, developing characters, plot, all that kind of stuff. And I received a comment that asked how I make my maps. So today's video is a introduction to that. Hopefully this is helpful insight into how I make my maps and how maybe you can plot out your own. So I've talked about my big notebook a few times before. This is it. It's just printed on newsprint, so it's a recycled paper, which makes it a cheaper notebook to have, but it's really great because one of the things that I like to do is I like doing sketching. Really helps me to brainstorm. So you can see I've got a huge big piece to work with, and then if you're someone who sketches, there's something nice about having a huge space and not having to worry about, you know, a piece of paper that's like, you know, this big and only having that space. So I like using it for that. The other thing I use it for is timelines. So you can imagine, you know, just having this great big space that I can work on. I often work on the floor, and then I would have pieces of paper for my timeline all over my floor. So instead what I can do, although I still have the timeline on my floor, I can transfer it more easily to this bigger notebook. And the other thing I use this for is for making world maps. So for my story, I used a notebook like this. This is actually my second notebook that I have because I filled up the other one, and that's got a lot of my story notes in it. I used this for my world map, and I really suggest, if you are doing a world map, to get yourself a really big space to work on, because if you have a really small sheet of paper, you know, like this one, I don't know if we can see it, just, you know, regular piece of paper, it's not a lot of space and it feels very limiting. This might be just my personality type. I like to have a lot of space to work with. So I suggest starting with a notebook like this. Now for today's video, I'm not going to talk so much about a world map because that's a bigger, sort of more complicated thing, but instead I'm just going to talk about a basic first map. Maybe it can pertain to a world map, but maybe it's going to just have to do with you know, a smaller scale map. So for today's video, I am going to be using this piece of paper. I'm going to be drawing on top of my notepad just because I don't want to wreck my table underneath. So yeah, I'm going to be working on a small piece like this, and hopefully this video makes sense. Okay. So when I'm starting a map, the first thing I want to do is plot out the things I know. And this is the kingdoms you've established. This is, you know, the path that your characters take, where they start from and where they end up. And the best way to plot out the things you know is by doing them in order of you know, how they happen. So for instance, if I have a character who, you know, comes through a magical tree. Okay, so we have a magical tree here. Dun, da, da. Oh, there's a magical tree. Okay, and I have my character who, I don't know, this tree is like a portal or something. So the character comes through this tree and into this world that I've created. And I know that after the tree, the character goes to a village that isn't too far off. And it takes my character maybe half a night. And so for half a night, I'm going to use maybe one finger as a spacing, and there is a village. And so I'm going to just draw my little village. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, as you can see. Okay, and I'm going to just keep in mind that one spacing means it's a half night journey away. Okay, and then after the village, my character goes to a cave that is in the forest that surrounds this village. So I'm gonna put some, you know, trees in here because there's a forest all around this village. Okay. I guess that's why there was the magical tree portal here, right? Okay. And it takes my character 2 days to get to this cave. And so what I'm gonna do is say, you know, if this is half a night, then 2 fingers are going to be a whole day. So I need about 4 fingers spacing, and that's where I'm going to put my cave. So my cave is here. And then after the cave, my character journeys for 3 days, let's say. So we're going to need 2, 4, 6 fingers. And they journey to a waterfall. and the waterfall is here, okay? And then after that, there is, at the bottom of a waterfall, there's like this nice big bay. So I'm gonna draw a bay. And right at the mouth of the waterfall, there is this empire. So I'm gonna just draw a few houses to signify that this is an empire. Okay, and so let's say this is my entire story plot, or this is just the first, few bits of my story plot. The character starts here, moves to here, to here, to here. And what you want to do then after this, after you have these general things, is fill in the things you don't know. And so, for instance, that is what is between the forest that's around the village and this cave. Is it more forest? Are there certain rivers? Are there certain creeks? So let's say there are, there's more forest. It's a great big forest. So I'm going to draw some more trees here. Okay. And, I'm going to say, just for interest's sake, let's say there is a river that goes past here, because I'm going to say this village actually needs a river, to receive certain supplies. So there's a river that goes past this village, and actually goes past out this way, comes past the cave, and my character actually maybe takes a river to get to the waterfall. So, and then maybe it's the river that they're following. So I'm going to put this river in. Here's my waterfall, and I have to establish, what's all around this area. And maybe after this, actually, there's some mountains back here, because maybe that makes sense for my book, and maybe it's because I don't know what else to put there, so I'm going to put mountains there. Okay. Now, again, you want to do the same thing here. What's between this space and this? Obviously, there's an elevation change, so that's something to keep in consideration. So maybe this is mountainous here too. Maybe there's a sort of a pathway of mountains or a glen of mountains, and then it sort of swoops down, and this is more part of the valley, and mountains pick up, in this space here. So I'm getting a little bit of dimension to my land. So when you're first starting to sort of chart things out, you want to say, where are the main things I know? What are the things I could guess that's between them? And, what are the things I can sort of play with and have a little fun with? So you start with something like this, and then after I've got this, what I would do is get another piece of paper. Now for the next stage, for making your rough sketch here into more of a map, there's one of two things you can do. So what I've just recently done for the maps that I've been making is my maps were made out of the larger world map that I made. And so what I did is I made a large world map, and then I took a picture of the area that I was actually going to be focusing on, and then I used that to chart out my general terrain. The other option you can do is just say, a world map isn't important right now, so I'm just going to focus on the general terrain of this area. So let's say you go with that option, the latter one. And what we want to do then is put in, again, the things that we know. Now, we're not going to have to worry about borders around us. So what I always like to do is make myself a square. I'm going to say that. This is nothing, too specific, just a general space that I can work within. And this becomes my border that I have to worry about. So I don't have to worry about edges and that sort of thing. So I'm going to work inside of here. And I'm going to say, now this next part I'm going to do in pencil. I was kind of using pen just because I thought it'd be a little darker. It might be easier to see. But I'm going to use pencil now for the inside because I'm going to have to change it up as I go. So for instance, if I say my magic tree is here, okay, it's my magic tree. And I use the same thing and I say, then there's a village here, okay? And we know that there is a water source, and so we have to ask, where is that with the river that runs past, through the village? I think it runs behind the village. Yes, and then behind the cave and that sort of thing. So I'm going to say that there's actually a great bit of water up here. So I'm just making guesses, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. There's a great bit of water here. And again, we have my forest that's all around here. My, let's see. Let's say actually we want to make this a little smaller scale. So I'm going to say half of my finger is my half day's walk. So the village is actually shows up very pretty close. And then we've got the cave will now be here, right? My river runs past it. Down here to my waterfall, which feeds into a greater area. Now when I'm making a map, I like to have things go off the border so I don't feel like I have to define everything. So here's my little empire, right? Here's my waterfall right off of here. This is my mountainous area. This also, right? It's a little mountainous. All of this is forest, and just for the sake of quickness, I'm just going to make my forest like this, okay? And then what you do after this sort of depends on what kind of terrain you do. Now, just for the sake of clarity, I'm just going to highlight my water stuff in blue for you guys so that you can kind of keep track of what I'm marking here, okay? Here's my water. So what you have to do is you have to start asking questions about what is this land, what is this land like? And if you're not certain about the surrounding area, if you really don't know, you need to ask yourself questions like what kinds of creatures live here? And that's something when I was establishing my world map, that's something that I did is I said, well, there's, these main types of creatures and they sort of live here and here and here and here. And I just sort of made it up. And then from there I went, well, I've got, over here, there are, this mountainous ridge. Let's say this mountainous ridge sort of ribbons through like this. And that's kind of interesting. And we can say, okay, well, if I had a mountainous ridge here I came across, what would we call it? Now let's say the city calls it, maybe they call it the Wall. And our made-up reason for why they call it the Wall is because it separates this empire, maybe this main empire, from the empire that's just over the wall. So let's say there's another empire over here, okay? And we're just making it up. We're just trying to fill up our world. And what makes it important that these two empires are separated, and what makes the empires different? What makes them similar? And so let's just say for good fun that this is a goblin empire. And this, because it's based on the water, let's say it is a merfolk empire. Just for kicks and giggles, just for some fun. Now, what we want to ask ourselves is, does this water source here, like it gives off a river, does it give off any more rivers? So for instance, because rivers often go into each other, let's say we have this one, and it falls down like this, and this river actually slithers through our mountains. I'm not sure how. Maybe there's a bit of a valley here, right? So this is where we can use our eraser. Okay, we have to get rid of our name. That's okay. The Wall, very impressive name. So let's say there's a bit of a valley here. There's actually a break in the wall, okay? And we could make our valley a few different ways, but we're gonna just make it like this to suggest there's a ridge and the river cuts down through the mountains. This is where you do more storytelling. So for instance, so this is the wall, it's the great separator between this kingdom and this kingdom, but there is this river that runs through, so why can't this be a place of connection? Well, it can't be a place of connection because the goblins, of course, they've got all sorts of goblin militia that hang out in the ridge, and that's what we'll call it, right? We'll call it the ridge. Right? or the Black Ridge, the Dark Ridge, whatever you want, okay? And they keep certain barricades. We want to ask questions about, well, what is this place like? Where the river that runs through the mountains from the Goblin encampment into the, Merfolk kingdom, what is this place like? Is there quite a bit of conflict? Are there, little villages here? So when you're map making, the main thing is you want to just ask lots of questions. And when you don't have questions to ask, you want to just say, well, maybe there are, more rivers. I mean, certainly to have a big water source up here and to have only 2 rivers, I mean, that's not very much. So we could certainly make a few more things, and perhaps there's a river and it feeds into another water source here, and that's a good, source of, maybe this is a travel port for the goblins to expand out into the kingdom here, because they need some water. But maybe it's not. Maybe there's there's a river here and it cuts through. Don't know where it goes to, right? So I'm just going to highlight these in blue. So you can see them. And again, I wouldn't put any of this in color until I felt more sure of it. I like to work completely in pencil, and then as I become more and more sure, and I'm just going to shade in these water sources for you so you can kind of see. But I wouldn't worry about coloring anything in until I feel more sure about it. Here we go, another water source is up here. Okay, so this is essentially what you want to do. You want to ask questions. And again, you can continue doing that. I mean, like, what is between this great space and this great space? You have to ask those questions and figure that out. Now, the other thing that's important is sometimes when you're working with the map and it doesn't have any color on it, it can be kind of hard to keep track of things. And so although I would say, work largely in pencil so that you can just make a whole bunch of things up and then kind of erase and change them as you need to, sometimes you need to color coordinate just for your own sake. And so sometimes what I'll do is, like I've been doing, working in pencil and just adding it on, I'll do that. But the other thing I do sometimes when I am afraid to commit to making something, for sure there, what I'll do is I use cut up pieces of paper in different colors and I'll stick them on here, and that way I can move them around. So let me kind of show you what I mean by that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give each kingdom or people group a different color. And so for instance, let's say the goblins are pink and our merfolk are blue, because water. So I'm going to put, I know they have main kingdoms here, so I'm going to stick, I don't know if you guys can see those dots, hopefully you can. Okay, and let's say, because the only other kingdom I know about right now is this little village up here, let's say that they're a neutral kingdom, so I'm just going to make them yellow. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is establish, well, where are there other places where the goblins have some sort of community or where they inhabit or whatever. The first thing I know is that the goblins occupy the ridge. Okay, so I'm going to put a few along here. Okay, which tells me that if there were, for instance, maybe some neutral villages here, this would be quite the intense place to live. And so it's possible that instead of it being a neutral village, you might have a goblin village here, or you might have a merfolk kingdom, right? Depending on who is the more aggressive one. Now this is a water port and the merfolk would be living in the water. I don't know why their civilization is up here in the first place, but it's a pretend map. So let's say there's a merfolk kingdom here. It's a little bit more in the center of the bay. And then we have, if we look at like half a finger, it would take a half night to get to this mer kingdom here. Perhaps there is a goblin encampment, and then there's a few neutral encampments that are a little bit further away because obviously they're, you don't want to be too close to the goblins. They would do lots of raid attacks and that sort of thing. So these neutral kingdoms are farther away. Or perhaps there used to be, a kingdom, there used to be all these villages along the banks because it's beautiful, who doesn't want waterfront? But because of goblin attacks, they had to move up closer into the mountains, okay? So what I could even do with that is I could establish them here and show they used to be here, right? But they moved up. And again, all this story that I'm making up on the basis of my map and where things are. So this is why I like to use maps to help me kind of figure out things in my story, is because sometimes just by seeing it and seeing the placement, it makes you kind of, you know, rethink things, and you go, well, obviously, I mean, if I live this close to a goblin encampment, I might want to move away, or I might have, you know, an interesting history. Now, that brings to question this village right here. In a way, it's sort of been left behind. All of these ones went up and moved into the mountains, but this one remained. So there's a question, why did this remain? And maybe I can give it a name, you know, based off the fact that it stayed there. I would continue using these dots to kind of fill up my space. And so I would ask questions, well, you know, are there merfolk encampments up here? Are they just down here? Let's say they have one up here, but it is a different kingdom. So I'm gonna just go like this to differentiate between, you know, villages of this kingdom compared to villages for another kingdom. So let's say there's those. And our goblins, you know, considering how close they are to the mountains, I wonder if the goblins like living in the mountains. And so maybe just like they inhabit this ridge, maybe they have a village here by this waterfront place. Do the goblins maybe have a encampment? Maybe it's a secret encampment up here, you know, up in our mountains. I'm just gonna make those a little darker so we can see them. Okay, our mountains. Okay, so we're just kind of filling it in based off of what we know. Here's our valley. Ta-dun, ta-dun. Okay, there's our cave. This is our main village and our magic tree, right? And then all around here is forest. And so maybe just for my own sake, I'm going to color in my forest like this, all in green. And then when I do color in the whole thing, I can color my green in like a lighter, you know, lighter shade or whatever. So I like to use color and I like to use dots in this way. Now another thing that you can do, and this is lots of fun, is you establish things just like we've been doing by asking questions. And maybe I'm thinking about my merfolk kingdom, so which I put on the land here. I'm not sure why it is. So I'm going to actually extend it up like this to suggest that there's a space, you know, above the falls, in which they have a kingdom. So it's sort of an elevated kingdom, if that makes sense. It's like up on this ridge where the falls are. So I'm gonna go like this. Here's our falls, and actually maybe the waterfall is like real big, and there's the main kingdom up here that somehow is on top of the waterfall. I'm not sure how it's doing that. I'm just noticing now I've used dark blue pen. Oh my goodness. For the sake of consistency, let me just go over this. Oh goodness gracious. Okay, and then I'm going to change my mind about this kingdom here. I'm going to say that the merfolks, they keep their, you know, their little villages are all here. Okay, maybe they have got 3 main kingdoms, and then as sort of a in-between space and then to sort of discourage people, I'm going to put some islands in here. And the purpose of these islands is, 1, I think I'd like some islands, but 2, these islands work as a barricade so that like you have the wall that strings through, this also cuts it up, and so whoever lives in this part of the merfolk kingdom is sort of living on the outskirts. And so I'm going to put some islands here, you know. And then the fun thing about this is that I can make these islands shaped in a certain way, or I'm wishing I would have worked in pencil. Like I said, you should work in pencil. I would kind of shape it a little differently. But let's just say, you know what, I'm going to make up, here we go, like this. I'm going to make a shape. I'm going to make it happen. Okay. Da-dun, da-dun. So maybe this doesn't look like it to you, but I think it kind of looks like a dragon body. So we're going to call them the Dragon Islands. because it's in the shape of a dragon. And again, maybe that doesn't look like it to you, but to me and my map maker's eye, this sort of looks like a dragon. This is the dragon's wing. This is the dragon's mouth, right? And then you can call the islands accordingly. So this could be dragon mouth, or it could be called the mouth, right? These are the claws, here are my feet, here's my tail, my wings, okay? So these are the dragon islands, okay? And then it makes me wonder, okay, if I have this, does anybody live on these islands? If we look, okay, it's about a day's walk across most of them, so they're pretty small islands. What kind of people live on these islands? Is it possible that some of the people from these villages that retreated, some of them kind of went into here? So as some were retreated, some went over here. So I'm going to say that that's possibly true. And I'm going to put some neutral villages. But I would suggest that if you're living on these islands, you're maybe involved in some sort of coastal trade. Perhaps these people trade with whatever is over here on this side, I'm not sure. And then as you're kind of finishing up your map and you're feeling good about it, then what I suggest you do is just come in with some color, right? So you got some gray, there are mountains. This is obviously a very rough map, and for myself, I like to have something a little bit more finished feeling, but what I'm trying to show you is that when you are making a map, you want to just be generous with yourself in the way that you make some really rough looking things, okay, like this one, where you're just mapping it out, you're not worrying too much about spacing and that sort of thing. And then you put it onto another map, and what's going to happen is your map is going to change as your story changes. And sometimes your map helps to change your story, and that's kind of fun, and that's where, you know, brainstorming with the map making can be really fun. The biggest suggestion for if you're trying to work on a map is work in pencil. Just draw things out, and if you're not liking where things are, you can change them as you go, but don't, I would really suggest you just let yourself get kind of wild, and like, again, with making something really rough like this, where you just go, this is generally where it is, and it's very possible you're gonna have to change this completely. Maybe it doesn't make sense, but don't worry about that in your initial stage. In your initial stage, just map it out. And even if it's something like, okay, so the character goes, you know, here, then here, then here, then here, then here, and then they go, you know, upriver to this other village, and then they take this, there's this valley way or whatever, and they go up here, and you realize that wherever they go to here would be, you know, nowhere near here. That's okay, because now what you need to do is when you make your map again, you need to just change, you know, this spacing around. So allow yourself to make some crappy maps, so that way you can just make another version that's a little more fine-tuned, and then you make another version that's a little more fine-tuned, and another version that is a little more fine-tuned. So the main things I would suggest when you are going about making a map or starting with a map is, one of the things I didn't mention in the video, which is really, really basic and something that I do frequently, is if you're making a map, do some research on maps. When I am map making, I like to pull up Google and just look at, you know, aerial shots. I like to, you know, I'll search within my neighborhood and places that I've walked, and I know this is a certain stretch, so I can get an idea for space. So I'll Google, like, you know, how long it takes to walk from here to here, and use that sort of as an idea. So if you haven't already, like, look at maps, because you're drawing a map. The other thing that's good to do along the same lines is look at stylistic maps. You know, if you want to mimic, you know, a certain artist's way of map making, although I think at the level of brainstorming and where you're maybe at for your map, you're not focusing on a polished map. You don't need to worry about that too much, but it is helpful to look at how do other map makers stylize their maps, or, you know, mark mountain ridges, villages, rivers, waterways, monsters, all that kind of stuff. So look at maps. The other thing is, when I'm map making, and obviously I didn't do this during the video because I had to be talking out loud, is when I'm map making, I like to put on some music that I normally use when I'm writing. Music that's going to really encourage me to think about my world. I have a video all about writing playlists. I'm a big fan of them. I have certain playlists for certain characters, for certain portions of my book, for certain creatures and that sort of thing. So when I'm making a map, I put on a playlist that's going to make me think about that area, songs where I have written about that area, you know, while listening to it, and that kind of helps me just get into the groove. You don't want to be watching TV or, you know, no music or whatever. I like to have some music on so I can just focus and kind of daze out and brainstorm and draw. So listen to some music. The other thing is, work in pencil. So that way you can just be outrageous, make all sorts of claims on your map, and then change them as you need to. I showed a little bit of that about working with pencil and changing it as you feel necessary, but work in pencil. And the next tip is along the same lines as working in pencil, and that is, know you're going to have to make a few different maps in order to get a map that you're happy with. So be okay with revisions, be okay with making a really crappy map and just remaking it and remaking it and remaking it, because it's this process that gets you to a map where you're really happy with it, a map that you can, you know, reference back as you're working on your story and that sort of thing. And the last thing is, you know, as much as I say work in pencil, when you are getting kind of confused or you need to differentiate between things, don't be afraid to put in color, because again, the map you're working on maybe has to be redone anyways. So use colored pencils, use little bits of paper to mark out things, color coordinate stuff if that helps you. Don't be afraid to use color. So to summarize, my main tips are: look at other maps, use pencil, listen to music that inspires you, know that you're going to have to make a bunch of other maps, and use color to help differentiate. I think that was all my points. I hope this has been helpful. Again, if you have any further questions, or if you'd like me to make more videos about this or videos about other particular brainstorming things, comment down below, let me know what those are. As always, guys, let's be a community of writers that help each other out. And cheers.